So our second set of snippets for this week is going to look at the late Eisenhower administration and the transition into the Kennedy administration. There had been this sense under both Truman and under Eisenhower that the U.S. was ahead of the Soviet Union scientifically in terms of nuclear technology. And then in 1957, the Soviets launched this satellite called Sputnik into the atmosphere. And in retrospect, it wasn't the most impressive achievement, but it creates this sense that the U.S. had fallen behind. And in the aftermath, Eisenhower pushes through a couple of basically domestic programs which are designed to enhance the U.S. position in the Cold War, but which long outlast the effects of the short-term need. The first is a measure called the National Defense Education Act, the NDEA, which is still around, which creates a variety of traditionally in the U.S. education had been exclusively a state or local policy, but creates a bunch of new federal programs designed to enhance cultural exchange between the United States and foreign countries, and also designed to ensure that local school districts taught in subjects that the federal government considered necessary for the Cold War. So in this case, yes, what we now call STEM subjects, and also foreign languages. A lot of this, these measures are still around. And then the second is Eisenhower's promotion of the interstate highway system. And his thinking here is that this is a national security imperative, because it will allow for the movement of troops and weapons more easily. In the event of an invasion or prospective invasion. But its major effect is to dramatically tilt the nature of the American population away from urban areas and towards suburbs. So here's a map from 1950, so pre-creation of the interstate highway system, in which you can sort of get a sense of population density. It's still very heavily skewed up here in the Northeast. You have these huge swaths of area where there's almost no one who lives there. But by 2000, you see a quite different environment, much more dense populations in Southern California or in Arizona, in Texas and Florida. A lot of these are associated with increased defense spending, also in Washington State. So the country's population moves to the south and the west, a region of the country called the Sun Belt, which at this point tended to, now it's like California is super liberal, but at this point, these Sun Belt areas, very, very heavily reliant on defense spending for employment purposes, tended to be more right of center, kind of pushed American politics towards the right. And you can see from this chart, between 1900 and 2000, the American population as a whole, people move out of the Midwest and out of the Northeast and into the South and the West. And this is not just defense spending. I mean, the creation of air conditioning is pretty important here as well. And other economic opportunities. A lot of these states tend to be sort of, have sort of union laws, and so business expenses are a lot cheaper in these states. But the country's population centers do shift over time, and this is at least in part due to Eisenhower's policy. So we have this international crisis caused by the sense that the Soviets might be moving ahead of the U.S., and then these domestic policies, which transform the U.S. both in education and population in various ways. In the 1960 campaign, John Kennedy runs against Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. It's a bitter campaign. The differences between the two on foreign policy are minute, and if anything, Kennedy runs to Nixon's right. He argues that the U.S. had not sufficiently waged the Cold War with sufficient aggressiveness, and it's not clear whether this line of argument helped Kennedy very much. It certainly didn't hurt him, but definitely, Nixon Kennedy wasn't saying that the Eisenhower administration was too hard on the Soviets in the Cold War or anything like that. Kennedy very, very narrowly wins. He delivers a bellicose inauguration speech in which he promises to pay any price, to bear any burden in the crusade against the international communism. And he faces an almost immediate sort of crisis caused in Cuba, where in 1959 Fidel Castro had taken over. The photo on the left is Castro addressing the UN. The photo on the right is a meeting of him with Richard Nixon at the time. And Cuba had basically been a U.S. satellite country since the 1930s. The U.S. had more or less controlled its foreign policy. It had democratic elections, but the governments didn't challenge U.S. economic primacy in the island. And Castro, I mean, we all know how Castro's regime ends in this kind of brutal dictatorship, but that's not the impression of the time in 59 and 60. He's this young, dashing revolutionary. It seems like he holds a tremendous amount of promise, and he has an internationalist message. That is that he says he wants to position Cuba as. Oops, why did that happen? Position Cuba as a rival to the United States, and an anti-imperialist rival to the United States in the Western Hemisphere. Kennedy had attacked the Eisenhower administration for not removing Castro in the election. It turns out that the Eisenhower administration had developed a covert plan very similar to the Guatemala plan. Remember, he overthrew the Guatemalan government. So to create a band of exiles, have them launch a small invasion, and hope that would stimulate the Cuban military to react. There were two problems with this plan. The first is that, unlike Guatemala, Cuba was an island, so you would have to actually sail these exiles over. It make it much plausible deniability factor wouldn't be there. And secondly, Castro and his chief lieutenant, Che Guevara, had learned from what happened in Guatemala. And one of their lessons was that the revolutionary regime there should have gotten rid of the military, and because at the end of the day, the military would bow to U.S. pressure. Which is exactly what happened in Guatemala. And in Cuba, they do get rid of the military, often through brutal means. And so there was no potential really for a military uprising in Cuba because the military already had been neutered. The result was this invasion, the wonderfully named Bay of Pigs, leads to an almost immediate capture of the exile force. Castro had also placed informants within the invasion. This is a tremendous embarrassment to the Kennedy administration, and it creates an image which had been fostered by Republicans in the presidential campaign that Kennedy, who was very young for a president, only 43 years old, was kind of over his head as a president. And so in 1961, Khrushchev decides to test this, sort of press a Soviet advantage. So this is a photo of Khrushchev with the East German leader, Walter Ulbricht. Remember, Germany had been divided after World War II into a pro-US Western Germany and a Soviet satellite, Eastern Germany. But there had been a key problem in East Germany, and that is that the capital of East Germany, Berlin, was divided, and the communists only controlled East Berlin. West Berlin was under the control of the non-communist forces, and Khrushchev was worried about this because the best and the brightest of East Germany, younger people, better educated people, were living in East Germany is kind of a prison camp, and so these they leave through the West Berlin airport and fly out to West Germany and never come back. Germany, East Germany is losing several 100,000 people per year in the late 1950s. He wants to choke this off. So in 1961, at their first meeting, at a summit meeting in Vienna, Khrushchev kind of blusters with Kennedy basically wants to pressure Kennedy into resolving the situation in Berlin, maybe by pulling out U.S. forces. Says that Khrushchev might conclude a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would allow the East Germans, or give the East Germans, a green light to invade West Berlin. Kennedy doesn't back down, but the image he gets from this is that the Soviets have become very, very, very aggressive. The irony here is that Khrushchev was he was acting out of desperation. What he understood is that basically the only people left in East Germany, if these patterns were going to continue, would be the hardest of hardline communists and pensioners, people over 65 whose pensions were being paid by the state. And so when Kennedy basically doesn't back down, instead, in a surprise move, Khrushchev authorizes the construction of a wall between East and West Berlin. The wall extends below ground. There had been an all Berlin subway, so you could take the subway from East Berlin into West Berlin, and then board an airplane from into West Berlin, into West Germany. There's barbed wire that is placed up on this wall. The East German guards are given orders to shoot to kill any East Germans who try to cross the wall into West Germany, and the wall, which is perceived and criticized by some conservatives in the U.S. as another indication of Kennedy's weaknesses, in fact, is one of the greatest propaganda victories for the United States in the Cold War, because the U.S. then can constantly argue, look, the situation in these Soviet satellite states is so horrible that they literally have to build a barrier to keep the people in, and they'll kill you if you try to get out. But from Khrushchev's standpoint, this seems like a reasonable compromise to make. So the key point with the Berlin Wall, apart from this propaganda disaster from the Soviet Union, is that it reinforces this emerging image of Khrushchev in the West as someone who is kind of reckless, who does odd things. I mean, no one had really anticipated the structure of a wall, and this will become a big issue, as we move forward in the Kennedy administration. So this is it for our second snippet.